Right, so welcome finally to our first session of the Terraforming program here at Strelka. It's been several months at least in the works for us to all convene here. And so it's really wonderful to see you all, as I said the other day, all together, sort of in the same room. It's I first just want to say thank you for choosing to be part of this this program and this, especially the first year as we inaugurate the research program. We will, as Nikolai had, I think, sent out in terms of his schedule, our plan for this first week is to really set the foundation for the direction of inquiry and research exploration that we'll be developing together over the course of the what I promise to be a very intense 5 months together. And so as I said to a few of you the other day, my recommendation for how to approach that is pace yourself for this time. And so we will pace ourselves a little bit this first week as well. The plan really is to go through and discuss in some detail the brief that wrote this summer for the program. Some of the questions that it poses that are meant to be probably a bit polemical and provocative, and to a greater or lesser degree unanswered at this point. What the parameters of those answers might be is one of the things that we will hope to elucidate together over this period of time. So some of the things that we'll be working with that we'll be considering might be dealt with, again, as kind of open-ended questions. Other ones perhaps a bit more axiomatic, more sort of first principle, control variables, if you like, for the experiment, and to understand what the relationship between some of those will be. And so this morning we'll dive into this as mentioned. The quote that I have up here, this sort of our sort of primary axiom, I suppose. The terraforming is to define our terms, the comprehensive project to transform Earth, cities, technologies, and ecosystems to ensure that the planet will be capable of supporting Earth-like life. That this itself is uncertain. Itself is perhaps what defines the moment that makes a program like this hopefully necessary. And as we'll talk about in great detail over the next few days, these figures of artificiality, astronomy, and automation will play key roles in both defining the parameters of what we mean by viability and the comprehensiveness of that project itself, to form the basis of an alternative planetarity. So this notion of planetarity will be one that we will introduce and come back to again in a number of different ways. We're discussing the different valences in terms of what that means, the difference between a world and a planet in particular. To unpack this a little bit further, there's more than one terraforming project that is at play in our discussion. One is, as we've defined it here, is this more futural terraforming, the thing that needs to be done now and over the course of the next coming decades with as much deliberateness as possible in order to try to guarantee the viability of that planetarity. But there's two others that are equally important as connotations and notions of terraforming. They're equally important in order to even propose such a thing. One is the idea that no matter what we do, no matter what the engagement with our climatic systems, geological systems, urban systems, and interrelation, no matter what we do, whatever we do will have an effect that is itself a kind of terraforming scale transformation of the planet. Whether if tomorrow everything shuts off, everybody goes full Kaczynski, and we reset. The effects of this on a planetary system would be fundamentally transformative. And so one of the principles, well, this is more on the axiomatic side of the ledger, is that the terraforming is not optional. Terraforming is not a hypothetical. Terraforming is not in and of itself as a relationship to the planetary condition itself is not one that is conditional on our electing to engage and participate. The question, in a sense, is not whether there will be a terraforming, but rather which and what, and for what ends, and by whom, and in what way, and defined on what terms. Correspondent with this is this third connotation of the term, equally important, particularly in the investigation of how we got here, that could be seen as a kind of a definition or shifting of the connotation of this era that we might call the Anthropocene, or capital-ocene, or Cthulhu-ocene, or whatever your preferred prefixes are, as itself a kind of accidental terraforming project, a kind of headless geoengineering that operated without real plan, operated without real steerage, that was a kind of self-catalyzing process, even a bottom-up kind of dynamic. Now, the role of other kinds of functions within this, like capital notwithstanding, the implication of this also is that if over this period of 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, take your pick, there has been this disorganized terraforming process, and it has resulted in a condition that we wouldn't recognize as viable, that the terraforming project to come is one in which the role of the deliberate planning, the artificiality of the initiative itself suggests as a kind of alternative to this as well. So the idea itself is not necessarily, doesn't come from necessarily, obviously has a number of different precedents. There's an old quote from our friend Frederick Jameson that goes, the glory of the Anthropocene, however, has been to show that we really can change the world. Now it would be intelligent to terraform it. In other words, the good news of the Anthropocene, the bad news of the Anthropocene is that we have put the planet in a position in which it's the ongoingness of what we would recognize as a viable Earth ecosystem is in jeopardy. The good news is that it is demonstrated it is possible to transform a whole planet in a relatively short period of time because we've already, that's what we've done. And there's certainly other sort of entry points and approaches into this. So, in the preface to the brief, I lay out some ways to position how I see the initiative, that is the terraforming project, not the terraforming that is inevitable or the terraforming that got us here, but the terraforming as project in relationship to urbanism. Because cities themselves, this being Strelka, cities themselves will be both inevitably and evitably, I suppose, the locus and focus of how we seek to ground, compose, and mediate that project itself. So what kind of urbanism are we talking about? It is described as an urbanism that is pro-planning, which at a certain moment in the history of realism would seem obvious, but in truth is by no means, that as I've indicated, the terraforming that got us here, the historical terraforming, is one that operated in a pathologically planless matter, pathologically planless sort of structure. And that part of what we wish to recognize is not only ways in which planned economies and planned ecologies actually never went away, even if we had imagined them to do so in different ways, but that the suppression of their process is part of the reason why they have not been able to operate as the plan that we need. And so part of the question is what the scope and structure of that plan should be, what it is that should be planned, what it is that can remain unplanned within this. Pro-artificial. As I'll talk in some detail this afternoon, the premise of artificiality forms a crucial philosophical cornerstone for the way in which we understand and define both our relationship to internal and external ecosystems, but also the conditions by which we would act in them and upon them. The connotation of artificiality that we're speaking of here is less artificial as in the opposite of, as in fake, or as in the opposite of the real, but artificial as in deliberately composed, as in something that has this trace of deliberate compositionality behind it. And part of the argument that I'll make, again in detail, more discussion this afternoon, is that the resistance to the necessity of artificiality, the resistance to artificiality as such, the denigration of the premise of artificiality, including this, it's in English, the collapse of connotations of the composed with the fake, or artifice, slight, there's a parallel and complementarity to the construction of certain forms of a nature-culture divide, which we'll also talk about. And that complementarity operates in ways that have been, in fact, not only not helpful in the composition of the terraforming we have, but in certain ways are essential to the recipe of the calamity in which we find ourselves. That the resistance to the artificial is part of why we can't have nice things. Anti-collapse also should seem to sort of to go without saying, but we start from the position that a degree of ongoingness of the accomplishments, both positive and negative, of the adventure, Homo sapiens adventure, including the urban settlements that we've constructed over the millennia, are worth keeping and worth protecting and worth extending into the future. That the premises of the entertainments of collapse, whether through a kind of acceleration of the contradictions of the moment so that a new tabula rasa or a new arrangement might emerge, or a kind of apocalyptic wish for the collapse and removal of the conditions it is, are not is not the starting point here, and we'll sort of diagnose some of the variations of those this notion as well. Pro-universalist. Part of the question that will inevitably come to and circumnavigate in a number of different ways is the relationship between what we call planetarity, the common condition of occupying a planet and understanding ourselves as in essence, one of the ways that the planet has folded itself to produce. One of the things that Earth does is it folds matter in particular ways to produce, to have ultimately over a period of time produced the cognitive capacities of Homo sapiens that not only occupy the planet, but the conception of our occupation is in fact one of the things that the planet does. That this implies a kind of, we'll call it universal relationship between different persons, cultures, places, histories, while at the same time recognizing that the histories through which each of us arrives at that shared position, or through which we have us and the historical vectors that put us there within the shared condition are quite different, and that, to be quite direct, that the premises that universality implies a project or discourse or position that is uniquely Western is something that we wish to untangle and dismantle. The idea that universality is itself is a sort of a Western privilege or Western construction, and that what belongs to the non-Western is the particular, hopefully does not survive a proper provincialization of the West, so that the Western perspective is particularized in this particular way. So the question thus is a universality. There's a universality that, in a way, is a given of the common planetary condition, but the way in which we conceptualize that givenness and the ways in which that givenness becomes the basis of a project to compose an alternative planetarity is a universalism that itself needs to be written, needs to be thought. It's not there for us in the same way. This, I think, is tied to the next point of an anti-totality. So being anti something is not the same thing as being pro something, but an anti-totality position, which is part of the legacy of a generation of post-68 post-structuralism, among other things, would hold that a project or even a model of a situation that would inform a project that attempts to imagine the entirety of this project in some form of comprehensive abstraction is, in essence, either doomed to, at the very worst, doomed to failure, and at the very least, itself a form of discursive violence and the basis of other forms of real violence. One of the things that we will inevitably try, I think, for the discovery and composition of that universality, that we will have to learn to re-engage with, is the ways in which models of the whole, not a single model of the whole, but a plurality of models of the whole, multiple totalities, constitutes a basis by which the interplay between the particular within the universal actually even becomes possible to imagine and possible to compose with, in this sense. And so we have a suspicion of a notion that the comprehensiveness project can be reduced to only to a single totality, but rather than a pursuit of the multiples for this. Pro-materialist. As again, I'll talk a little bit around this of the artificiality. The part of the materialism that we are engaging with, or trying to articulate, is, I think, a bit different than the note connotations of materialism from the Marxist tradition, though not entirely, different from the connotations of materialism from the new materialist tradition, though not entirely. But in essence, it's a materialism that seeks to understand the conditions of that, the conditions of the circumstance that those models, total or not, would be derived, as one in which the fundamental fundamental and irreducible reality of chemistry becomes the real last instance against which, and constraint against which, thought must push against. Chemistry bats last. And at a moment in which the parts per million of CO2 becomes the brightest dot on the geopolitical dashboard, the question of chemistry, the reality of chemistry, the agency even of chemistry, and the imagination of this shouldn't be as difficult to think through as it actually is. However, as we'll also discuss, the connotations of the chemical are ones that have prevent us, I think, from engaging with this as directly as we should. At the same time, as I've already intimated, there's, in terms of this, how it is that we would seek to, at the most fundamental level, understand our own participation and our own involvement with the processes that we understand. It's also, in essence, an understanding of the appearance and emergence and even evolution of our cognition as part of this process, this ongoing process of the Earth folding itself in particular ways. That one of the things that it manages to do is to produce the prefrontal cortex of ambulatory bipedal Homo sapiens. You wait a little while, and long enough, they begin to transform the chemistry around them and begin to produce abstractions and models of those transformations in and of itself. So part of the materialism is not only an understanding of that it is the chemical last instance, that ultimately all geopolitics is geochemical, but that the models that we have of those processes, which are the basis and interface and medium through which we would think through them themselves, is matter thinking about matter, thinking about matter. Anti-Leviathan. So by Leviathan, we simply mean here really a stand-in for this principle of a kind of governing, of governance with a small g. That whatever the plan is, or the plans are, there has to be a way in which it can enforce itself. There has to be a way in which it has some provisional monopoly on the decisions that would ensue, and that would cascade and would multiply, that would guarantee the intended outcome of the plan. Certain ways in which legal systems do this by discursively modeling in advance what can and cannot be done, which is then represented in the real world. Technical systems do this in a different way by constraining the basis of actions and behaviors and constructions that can be taken with them, and so forth. And this relationship between what is traditionally, which is maybe more conventionally understood as the political and the technical, and how it is that they are sometimes kept at arm's length, understood in different ways, that enable different forms of technological determinism on the one hand and political reductionism on the other hand, will also be something that we will attempt to unwind, and in short, to think about ways in which the political and geopolitical transformations that perhaps that we are in most need of may not precede the technical and chemical transformations that we need. They, in fact, may be an outcome of those. And I will explain a little bit more what we mean by that. Anti-mythology, simply to say that there's, I think, is you certainly get the strong sense from the text and a working presumption that the ways in which we are, the conventional ways in which these issues are being thought through, by which we're defining what constitutes a climate or climate change, or the ethics and responsibility of Asian actions within this, are ones that constitute narratives and approaches that are, at the very least, not helpful, and in some ways I'll try to demonstrate are, in fact, not only are actually the causes of the problem that we're dealing with. That many of the ways, many of the ways in which we conceptualize progressive action in relationship to climate change are in fact the things that are causing the climate change that we wish to prevent in the first place. And by this I don't mean an adherence to techno-scientific rationality or something, but rather actually the pursuit of meaning for its own sake. This turns out to be by far the most ecologically expensive thing. Humans signaling to one another in such a way that the meaningfulness of it all comes to the fore. There's a critique of the cultural pursuit. And lastly in this list of a pro-egalitarian distribution, that through this all, I think there has to be, and this is perhaps more of a conjecture, I think that there has to be, at the level of both an intended means and an intended ends, the premise that the entire system and the entire system and the space of that viable planetary in which we would all occupy, that we would all live through and live with, is one that will be more viable, will be more resilient, will be more dynamic, will be more that will be more less prone to autocatalytic collapse, if it is one in which the fundamental resources of that planetary are distributed and structured in such a way that there is redundancy within the system, that there's the capacity for transformation and resistance and innovation within that system from multiple positions and within multiple positions. What that means to each of us, what the terms of this, for each of us, will be something that we'll be discussing a bit more as we go through this. So, real quickly then, a few of the other things that we'll be getting, this premise that the planet itself is in many ways now an artificially sentient entity, that climate change mitigation and pervasive automation not only should not be seen as necessarily at odds, but actually something that can and must converge. That the very concept of climate change, this is where the planetary scale computation comes in here. Part of the story, the very concept of climate change itself is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. The question to be asked of how is it that planetary scale computation might contribute to climate change mitigation, might contribute to an understanding and conceptualization of the circumstance that would allow us to act back upon this planet in such a way that would be beneficial, has to be asked in the context of this fact, that climate change, in quotes, the concept of climate change, is an accomplishment of a planetary scale sensing, calculation, modeling, mega apparatus that tells us so. The significance of this in relationship to how we approach this question of computation, I think, will become more clear. when we're defining automation in this context, and we'll go through this in sort of more detail, we want to see automation as something of a kind of a general principle by which technical and even ecological systems operate, by which agency cascades, by which decision cascades and reverberates through systems. There's a larger project, I think, to develop and understand a way in which those forms of technical automation and technical cascades, which we call the sort of forms of information signaling that operate within technical systems, and the forms of information signaling that operate within biological systems, what we call biosemiotics, might be understood as two versions within a larger comprehensive techno-bio semiotic operation. Because in reality, most of the systems that we would encounter, technical systems, biological systems, in which this agency and movement does cascade, are neither purely technical nor purely biological. They're always an amalgamation. Always an amalgamation of biological forms and non-biological technical forms, and the conditions of that transference by which a decision is made at one point, and as that decision is made at one point, or as that solution is concretized at one point, it repeats and echoes throughout that system downstream. That, in a way, is what the automation does. It's set in advance, it's constructed and determined in advance, but its reverberation down the stream is what the automation is for. There has to be a way of understanding both of these together. And then lastly, from this, that the fundamental shifts in the geopolitics, geoeconomics, that we all understand are necessary in order for that plan, the plans, to enforce itself, which goes down to a transformation in the ontology of value from which economic systems are comprised, to a shift in the relationship between geography, jurisdiction, and sovereignty in the political systems that would enforce this, may not precede the geotechnical transformations that we need, that would actually be the means through which we could act upon the planet to compose it towards this more viable planetarity. In fact, it may be the other way around. It may be that the geotechnical means that are required in order to literally and directly, materially recompose that planetary condition cannot happen without cannot exist without a particular economic condition that would allow them to happen, that would continuously enable them, and a geopolitical apparatus that would make the governance and steerage of that geotechnical apparatus possible in the first place. Historically, and I think there's just as much examples of this here as we can, that the emergence and consolidation of that technical system can produce and enable, because it requires a political and economic system in order to make it so. So, some more of these, which we'll go into detail. The surveillance of carbon flows is a good thing. And energy infrastructures based on long-term waste cycles are desirable. This goes precisely to what I'm suggesting about the geotechnical as potentially preceding the shift in the geopolitical and the geoeconomic. Energy infrastructures that really operate on deep long-term temporal cycles that we extract, we produce energy, the energy is transformed into electricity, that this process produces waste inevitably, that there is a capture, governance, storage, reconsumption of this waste, and that these processes are operating not in a matter of days and weeks and months or even years, but over multiple generations. This is the energy systems, the energy infrastructure that in fact we should in many ways aspire to. Long-term energy, I mean, in a certain sense, all energy systems that we've sort of developed are long-term in a certain sense. It takes a very long time to create fossil fuels, not particularly long time to generate invisible, anonymous, and unaccountable waste from the burning of the fossil fuel. But for example, an energy system that produces a waste product that is not invisible, that is discrete, that is dense, but takes a very, very, very long time to process, an uncannily long time to process, should not be something that we would disqualify in advance because it takes so long, because it's operating at this sort of longer term kind of structure. That is in fact the longer term process of the planetary metabolism in which we would situate any of our situate any of the projects for the design and composition of the urban crust in which we locate, should be ones that operate at a scale that is correspond with that metabolism itself. Or at the very least, we should not disqualify ones that do. That the ecological cost of culture is greater than that of science. It's always fun to give that talk to the art audience. They get really mad. That the viable planetarity requires a philosophy in and of outer space. As we'll talk a bit on Wednesday, and as you would have gotten a sense from the book, that the question of what we colloquially refer to as outer space has everything to do with the conceptualization, definition, and composition of that viable planetarity. In a nutshell, that the space programs from the 60s and 70s, one of the key outcomes of that space program, 60s and 70s, was the discovery of Earth as a planet. Not only in the sense of an external facing apparatus that was looking at other things within the solar system that by the mid-1970s had turned inward to observe and model and track and understand the planet from which they came. This sort of another kind of primordial moment by which the planet produces these sensory mechanisms about itself so that it might know itself in a particular way. And not only because it's through that apparatus that what we call climate change appears as a conclusion of Earth science modeling, but also in relationship to just the premise and conceptualization of the planet as such, 100%, and in relationship to its multiple alternatives, which we will sort of consider. And then the last point from this, and then we'll sort of move on to the next thing, is around the question of design and the kind of the way in which we want to approach the proposition of speculative design, and how we mean that, as opposed to an understanding of speculative design that would be seen as a kind of unconstrained design in which the parameters of the regular world are suspended in some way, so that the tools of design and the medium of representation of design might be deployed to imagine and communicate something that is that has no utility or function that is purely a matter of imagination. The connotation of speculative design that we will hold fast to is, in fact, in some ways the opposite. That it is through a deep and that is through the deep and unrelenting encounter with the constraint, with the world as it is, that design might compose propositions for engagement with those constraints that are in fact so functional and so utilitarian that they would appear to anyone as utterly bizarre. And the uncanniness and alien quality of the design doesn't come from the fact that it is fantastic. It comes from the fact that it is, in fact, it reveals something about the reality of that constraint that has otherwise been invisible, misunderstood, or suppressed. And ultimately, that the conventional designs that we would approach, how to make a city, what to do next, how to engage with these things, will seem equally bizarre, but in the sense to which that they in fact become the thing that is revealed to us as being totally fantastic and unrealistic. Okay, so a couple points then, just to sort of, since we're beginning this new program here, just to say a few words sort of at the beginning of the relationship of this, how we sort of, how I see some of the relationship between the terraforming program and the previous one. I think there's more at stake for this one as well. I think in many respects the focus and a sense of urgency that went into the composition of this program and this design brief is one that will prove fruitful in terms of the kind of research and the kinds of projects that we're able to develop with this. That, as I have told some people, that if New Normal was a program that, in essence, in the composition and imagination of what the scope of this was just something, it's kind of drawing a dotted line around something that already existed but had been sort of under-recognized and saying, oh, look, this is actually a thing. And once you saw the thing with the dotted line around it, it was like, oh, right, of course. But it, in ways, there's something that had been there been there in long. It was kind of a recognition of a moment and a naming of something that exists. The hope for the terraforming is a bit different than this. It's rather than to identify something that there's a discourse or approach or a set of terminologies and forms of common sense for design that already exist, but instead it's to, in fact, try to invent them, to try to invent approaches and models and understandings of the situation that we don't have, that are needed. Now, inevitably, there's going to be some tears. I don't mean in here, I mean out there. The ways in which we are, I think, entering into these questions, the parts of the approaches that have sharp edges to them will bump into people, and they will bump into things, and there will be some contestation of some of the things that we're doing here. That's okay. Don't be concerned about that or think about it. In fact, there's in a way in which the places and forms by which that resistance comes will be perhaps a good way to map the success of what we've done. If the right people get angry, or if the right people misunderstand us, then it's a way of kind of understanding that we're kind of in the right place. So this is a picture of the first the project showcase from the first year of the program. There's a few people here in the courtyard around this as well, but there was many more thousands of people watching online. We had, as you sort of all know, a lot of these projects have gone on to other venues, other lives in the rest of this world. This is all great. I strongly suspect that the work that comes out of this program will be considerably more visible than the work that had come out of the new normal program. Which is to say, on the one hand, we want to have a sense of trying to make some of those sharp edges of this work as sharp as possible, so they will cut through and make their way into the places where they ultimately need to settle and need to be located, or be welcomed in the rest of this. Of course, there'll also be a lot of the great thing, of course, of doing this sort of work is that there's lots of people who don't really who understand what you're doing and like it. There's people who understand what you're doing, don't understand what you're doing and like it. There's people who don't understand what you're doing and don't like it, and who do understand what you're doing. Anyway, all four permutations of here are quite possible. The people who do understand what we're doing and do like it are, of course, the ones that we are most interested in here. The adversarial position is not necessarily the kind of starting point, but I do think that there is a really strong need for a different approach, a different common sense, a different theoretical and practical language of understanding the relationship between technology and ecology, in particular technology, politics, economics, technology and ecology, that the available versions, the sort of rote schools of thought that we have at our disposal, and where in some sort of everything getting reduced to a kind of accelerationism or degrowth, Coke, Pepsi, whatever arrangement is in one milieu is just exemplary of the kind of tunnel vision that we've found for ourselves within this as well. And so the necessity for that alien language and alien approach is one that we'll be sort of working towards. A point then, before we get into this first chapter around the Copernican turn here. This very much is is one of the axioms of our approach, I think. And I place it here because I think that in certain sense, this may be the way in which the work that we do here is first understood in the most general sense by those who will receive it. The premise of the Copernican turn, of course, is that there is some means by which we humans understood ourselves as being the center of the world, which meant the same thing as the center of the universe, and that we figured something out by which we realized that we're actually not the center of something over here, and that this introduces a kind of traumatic response. Freud talked about the Copernican trauma, or the Copernican wound. So obviously Copernicus and Galileo and the determination of heliocentrism was a kind of Copernican trauma, one that has not been fully absorbed, I think, heliocentrism that is. But there's been a whole cascade of this since then of I would say that Darwinian biology was a kind of Copernican trauma that we sort of have not as a kind of central or separate species relation to the rest of biology, that even in the distinction of humans from animal, that this notion of the synthetic biology, neuroscience, all of the thinking is just a kind of thinking itself is a chemical epiphenomenon of processes happening in a pink goopy substance that excreting out of the top of your spinal column. It's more like digestion than divination. This is a Copernican trauma itself. Our starting point in many respects is that in the most direct sense that what had been called human-centered design is to be set aside for a moment, and that in the most direct and in the sort of broader sense that design itself is in desperate need of a kind of its own Copernican turn. But also that these Copernican traumas are priceless accomplishments, that they are, in a way, what we are here to, what it's for. Now, here's a bit of the paradox in terms of the way we're approaching this, though. This the decentering of the human, the critique of anthropomorphism more generally is, obviously has become a kind of a commonsensical trope within Western critical thought over the last sort of 10 years, various versions of it, variously secular and not quite secular. The way in which we're approaching this, though, is a bit different than some of these, in that the conclusion that we will draw from this, and will hopefully lead you to this a little bit step by step, is not one in which that the recognition of the decentered position of sort of the human, or that the materiality of Homo sapiens, that the basis of this possibility of our thing is one in which that is not separate from the world, that it is part of the world, and so forth and so on, that there's these metaphysical distantiations of human and the world are collapsed and division forward, does not mean that we abdicate or have no fundamental agency over the composition of that viable planetarity, but in fact, perhaps paradoxically, the opposite. That finally we have the planetarity over which that agency would work, and that the planetarity over which that agency would work is something that is revealed by the process of that Copernican trauma. I'll explain a little bit more as we go through this. But should we repeat the basic idea? All right. That through this Copernican trauma, and there's a number of steps I'm skipping here, but through the Copernican traumas of various sorts, which we'll define very specifically in a moment. And again, we define Copernican traumas really in this way, since we're on the topic. We have a model of the world, of how the world works. We produce some form of technical instrumentation that is predicated on that model of the world, so that we could measure the world, we could index the world, we could observe the world, we could do something, we could act upon the world in some kind of way. And that the parameters and structure and composition of that technical apparatus are themselves an expression of that initial model of the world. But in the use of that technical apparatus, properly, in the proper employment of that technical apparatus, something is discovered, disclosed, revealed about the world that undermines the initial model that made that technical apparatus possible in the first place. Microscopes, telescopes, and so forth being the kind of obvious, the sort of most at hand example here as well. That this process of a model of the world that is extended into a technical apparatus, and the proper use of this technical apparatus discloses that the model of the world was in fact wrong. This is the basis of this of this. And then there's this process by which, okay, the world is revealed to operate in a very different way than we thought that it would operate. Now we have to reconsolidate and reconstruct that model of the world in relationship to the way in which this moment of technical alienation from our intuitive experience of the world has made it so for us. Hooray for technical alienation. Through this moment of the technical alienation, these epistemological, these priceless epistemological accomplishments are not just the way in which we achieve some form of disenchanted, the capacity for a more disenchanted cognition, modeled cognition of the world, but in fact also the world itself. We are part of the medium by which those processes model themselves. And because we are inside those processes, and this is one of the things that the trauma reveals, is that the agency of those processes on themselves, and the agency of those processes to model themselves as they mediate, as we operate as the medium of those, that this is something, in fact, to be amplified. Okay, I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. It's not only Frederick Jameson, there's other brain geniuses that have, including Rand Paul, figured this out. Some of these issues of the terraforming Earth thing, this is this sort of crazy tweet from Rand Paul about terraforming other planets, and then somebody says, like, yeah, you think climate change happens everywhere except here. This is another way the project, but it's in fact it is this as I was speaking to Jamie King last night. So as you know, there's also, in addition to those who are here with us today, there are also 4 members of the cohort who are participating online, who are occasions, and you're going to meet them soon. They're going to, they'll Skype in. You get to talk to them as well, and they're working on their own sort of separate research projects around here as well. We thought that some of the work that they would do would be better suited this way. I'll talk a little bit about what in this talk today, but one of them, a person named Jamie King, is one of the things that she's working on has to do with this relationship between geoengineering and astroengineering, and the sort of the history of the conceptualization of the transformation of other planets and those transformations of the Earth itself. Real quickly then, as a sort of research themes that we've sort of set up as a sort of starting point, this idea that the cities in which we occupy are a kind of crust layer that exists under the surface, but that they are ultimately not separate from the extraterrestrial, that apparatus of sensing, modeling, and calculation infrastructure that is the mechanism through which this epistemological accomplishment of climate change emerges, and that this in certain ways expands the scope of literally the diameter, but also the scope of the planet within which we sort of work. What we'll call geonomos. Nomos is, as you may know, is a term that refers in the most direct sense to the logic by which the Earth is subdivided into a political geography, the means by the logic, and then the map that ensues from this as well. The question of what could be and should be the relationship between a real material planetary geography and the means by which our models of the processes can act back upon that planet. I mean, that's really what we're talking about when we're doing the governance, is how is it that the descriptive and predictive models of Earth systems can become the medium by which we can actually steer and compose those Earth systems. That's what governance, in this sense, means, and what the basis of that geographic construction means. Again, this premise of automation as an ecological process, of ecologies as inside of automation systems. Cities are actual ecologies. Ecosystems themselves are examples of a form of cascading agency and the repetition of decision through it. There is forms of abstraction within biological systems in that sense, and part of the way we want to understand this question of automation is not only in terms of the forms of productive machinic efficiencies that it supposedly allows for, but as a basis of a kind of definition, a redefinition of the relationship between the technical and the biological in relationship to this transference. What we'll call artificial metabolisms. As I intimated a bit earlier in relationship to the long-term energy systems, the notion of a planetary metabolism as one of the criteria by which the viable planetarity would be defined, which would include climatic processes, but it would include a lot of other things besides, including energy cycles. Also includes the ways in which that we compose artificial metabolic interventions within these, which absorb, produce, distribute, store, value, meter, capture, the reference in a number of different sorts of ways. And then lastly, this planetarnost is roughly Russian for planetarity, is the lessons to be learned both descriptively but also practically from the conceptualization of the existing planetary and potential planetarities from both real and conceptual exterior positions. Which, well, I'm going to set my next point aside because it'll make more little sense of context. Okay, so these are just as you get it, as a sense, some of the sort of the rough themes. Now, with your permission, I'm going to then we'll dive right into our hymnal here. Does everyone have there's one in the chair in front of you if you don't have this. And begin with a picture. And then with this quote from Chris Marker, the French filmmaker. Naive American contemplates the sky. The Russian, or at least that Russian, he's talking about Tarkovsky, settles in the sky and contemplates the earth. There's a number of things to be said about, which I didn't mention in the opening, but because I wanted to, instead of setting it aside as a kind of special point that really is something that is woven through everything that we're doing, the fact that we're doing this work here, that we're in Moscow, in Russia, at this point in time, is our perch. It's our particularity within that planetary scope. There are, as many as you know, multiple, diverse, contradictory, conflicting histories that made this particular place possible. By that I mean not only this seminar room and this institute, but even this city. Russia's relationship to planetarity through the Soviet space program, but before and after. The terraforming project that is and was the development of the Russian nation, from putting St. Petersburg in a place where a city probably shouldn't go, through the development of all the way through to the Siberia, Russia as a model terraforming process, and many other things besides. The project that we'll do, the research that we'll do, will be based here. That the projects to develop will be cited here. That we'll be engaging with this history, with this present, and with this future. And there are obviously any number of ways to enter into that. But let me then, as mentioned, I want to begin with a picture. This is a recent picture, as some of you may have seen, of the surface of the sun. People have been staring at the sun for a long time. Usually they learn not to, but sometimes they don't. So this is, and as you can see here, this is from a telescope it's on the mountain in Hawaii, near where the proposed Mauna Kea telescope, rather controversial initiative, is being located. We'll talk a little bit about this as well. So the surface of the sun looks like popcorn. I guess I can't take the music anymore. The question I was sort of thinking is I was asking myself as I was looking through this and kind of watching this, is whether or not would ever look at the sun the same way again, knowing that it's, in fact, knowing what it is. This thing that's ever present, that literally makes all visibility possible, but is itself cannot actually be looked at, cannot be seen. You can't look at the sun, even though it's the thing that makes looking as such is now seen. Is this a disenchantment? Is this disappointing? What is this? Now, let me go to another image then as well. As I mentioned sort of begin, there never was at least to my knowledge, a grassroots movement asking why we have never seen a picture of a black hole, as there was for a picture of the whole Earth. Nevertheless, last year we got one, this picture of the black hole. And perhaps the picture of the sun is on this list somewhere as well, but I think this is probably higher up on the list of the most significant images ever made. The most significant images that humans or the Earthlings have composed. But perhaps for what is this significant? We can also talk a little bit about some of the other things that might be on that list. One of the things that it's important to understand here is in unpacking a little bit about what's happening with this image and what it constitutes, is that what we see as a quote unquote image was constructed from data. Not a photographic process, a chemical process in the same way. It is constructed from data, not a conventional camera, that was composed through the event horizon. Event horizon is this network of telescopes harmonized to focus on a particular location and period of time, which looks roughly something like this. Now, the resolution of any image is dependent on the aperture of the camera that's taking the picture. Very, very wide, large aperture, you can have a very, very high resolution image. So the question we might ask is, what is the largest aperture possible? The largest aperture possible would roughly be a camera the size of the Earth itself. And so that is what the Event Horizon Telescope, or the network basically is. It's this non-contiguous perception engine linking telescopes from Greenland to Antarctica into a perceiving machine with an aperture as wide as the Earth, as wide as the Earth itself. So in other words, in order to make this image, the planet itself became the camera. The planet itself became the camera. This is really the key, the key point that I want to keep pulling on, at least in this point. As the planet looked out into this void, it sensed light that traveled back to it from sort of ancient times, and was able to produce this image through this vast sensing apparatus, this sensing surface. This transformation of the planet into a sensing surface now capable of sensing its arrangements. What we see in the image then is the orangey accretion disk of glowing gas being sucked into the void of the black hole at the center of the M87 galaxy, outlined by all of the non-void that it is about to consume. It's about 6.5 million times more massive than the sun. That was the thing in the first picture. And roughly 53 million light years away. So another way to think about this is that the light that the event horizon, the photons that the event horizon array, that mechanism by which the planet becomes a camera, the light that hit that array was emitted 53 million years ago during the Eocene period on Earth. A lot of dramatic methane flux and situations for the dinosaurs and so forth. But even without this, as you all know, looking up into the night sky itself is a kind of time machine. As you look up and you see the stars, the light that you're perceiving was emitted long before all of us were born, long before any of this kind of happening. Looking up, which is looking out, is also looking back in time. And the farther out, the farther back that you look, the further back in time that you see. Now, much closer by, there is a supermassive black hole in the center of the Milky Way, around which our galaxy spins. We have always been circling an omnivorous void. It's sort of the nature of things. Now, let me land this sort of question in a somewhat different way. One of and link this to this question of the the arrival or disclosure, if you like, of planetarity much more recently. The black hole image is part of a much longer lineage of astronomic imaging. Now, all of these, the mechanisms of any kind of astronomic imaging, like of any camera, are machines that emerge through the extraction, processing, and folding of minerals into very complex forms of metallic and plastic origami that are able to sense photons in different ways to produce these kinds of stunning pictures. Any image is a way in which that has this geologic underlying capacity to this or this. And again, central of these, and perhaps most important of these, are the multispectral images of Earth's biosphere and technosphere that have constituted the computational profiles of what we call climate science. So the Earth folds itself into a censoring apparatus by which it actually begins to not only take pictures of its immediate environment, but to represent itself. The first image from Earth, taken from space, was taken in 1946 by the US. US had captured a German V2 rocket after the war, wanted to see what this baby could do, strapped a camera to it, shot it up. It went higher than had originally been planned, and the camera captured an image of the horizon there as well. The 1946 picture obviously wasn't released right away. But as far as we know, this would be sort of the first picture. 1946. This is basically 4 or 5 seconds ago in the broad scheme of things. The Earth's 4.7 billion years old. In 1946, it managed to. It was the first time in which this visual representation of itself from the outside became possible. In the early and mid-1960s, multiple lunar orbiters, the Russians and the Americans both sent many, many lunar orbiters, so not landing on the moon, but craft that would go around the moon and then slingshot on the moon's gravity and come back, some of which were intended to crash in the moon, some weren't. The lunar orbiters sent back lots of different images from the Earth from outer space. This is 1964, I think, when you see this, even before the kind of Earthrise images. And it's at this point throughout just to give a little bit of contextual context, imagine throughout the early 1960s, after Sputnik, after Gagarin and all the rest of this, but in the early 1960s, the visual representation of the Earth from its physical outside begins to become a very important part of popular culture, both here in Russia, in the U.S. as well. The Soviet Mars orbiters, Mars 2 and Mars 3, both took this is the moon thing. Both took images of Mars in late 1971 and in early 1972. The former one of these, Mars 2, crash landed into Mars, which in doing so became the first human artifact on Mars. The first human artifact on another planet, however, was the Venera 3, the Soviet Venera 3 craft, which crashed into Venus in 1966. The U.S. never went to, when the U.S. never went to Venus, the Russian program went to Venus several times, and the first thing from Earth that landed on another planet was into Venus in 1966, quite a long time ago. This was one of several initial proposals for what the Russian moon lander was potentially going to look like. The last one that they ended up scrapping, the story where it sort of didn't work and they just scrapped it last minute. It didn't look anything like this, but this is my favorite, so that's what I showed. Now, as mentioned, there was the Mars 3 sent down a probe which did manage a soft landing on Mars. This is 1971 or 72. And it sent back a picture. For a long time, it was very unclear. It was a matter of some Cold War dispute and consultation exactly what this picture was a picture of. Whether or not, but it landed, went offline, but before it went live, it's managed to send this back. For a long time, Russia claimed that this was either a picture of the Martian horizon or of a sandstorm that had gotten in front of the camera, where the U.S. is like, no, no, it's not a picture of anything. It's just white noise. You haven't. It's just nothing. So maybe this is the first picture taken from another planet's spectrum. Maybe it's just noise, such as the apophenia of astronomical remote vision. Now, if it was a picture of Mars, then this would be the Viking 1, the U.S. craft sent back very, very clear pictures of Mars from 1976. 4 years later, this is not an issue. But of another planet, Venera 9, so usually landed on Venus in 1975, so before the U.S. Viking craft in 1976, which sent back what would still be the first images of another planet to Earth around this as well. If you haven't already, those of you who live in Moscow know about this, but those of you who haven't, the Cosmonautics Museum is absolutely a must to visit several times while you're here. We are in conversations with them to do some interesting things. They have all of these photographs there as well, and I was talking about like, oh yeah, we got that. I can go show you. They have an incredible range of things there as well. Okay, now the overview effect. The most literally iconic images of Earth, however, from space, are from the Apollo program. Many of these other ones are, which some of these may be more historically significant, but are culturally more obscure for whatever reason, namely the Earthrise image here and the blue marble image. First on the blue marble, 1972, Harrison Schmitt, US astronaut, points his slightly modified but not really Hasselblad camera that he took with him up on the craft, on the Apollo 17 craft, pointed it out the window. This was not even part of their the mission plan. He just was looked out the window, saw the Earth, and took lots of pictures of it. One of which became the iconic blue marble image, which would later adorn a billion T-shirts and coffee mugs and recycling tote bags and stuff. So in addition to providing a visual identity for the nascent ecological movement, it also symbolized what Frank White would later call the overview effect. This numinous spiritual feeling of profound awareness felt by those who have experienced spaceflight of seeing this pale blue dot all at once, seeing the entirety of our condition as this little precious, fragile place. In 1948, but this idea precedes Frank White. So in 1948, Fred Hoyle, the British astronomer, says something and sums it up this way. He's sort of imagining what will happen culturally, psychologically, politically once an image of the Earth becomes possible. He's writing 1948. This is 2 years after the V2 rocket image, but before this had been made public. Quote, once a photograph of Earth as taken from the outside is available, we shall, in an emotional sense, acquire an additional dimension. Once the sheer isolation of the Earth becomes plain to everyone, whatever his nationality or creed, a new idea as powerful as any in history will be let loose. In an instance, the aha moment of the totality of planetarity itself would be a kind of a little revelation around, and that this would become surprising. So, our friend Stuart Brand read about this, that he read about that in the earlier Apollo missions, that there were, in fact, that Schmitt had taken, that there were images of photographs of the Earth taken from the outside, that NASA possessed these. They weren't really necessarily part of the flight, but the astronauts had talked about it. It wasn't secret, they just didn't think it was such a big deal. That they possessed these, and so one day, having taken a lot of acid, he has this pre-revelation that once everyone sees the image from the Earth from the outside, that this will be this kind of forking moment within human history, and that makes it his mission to make this possible. And so he distributes these little buttons. Why haven't we seen a picture of a photograph of the whole Earth yet, which were everywhere in the 1970s? And eventually they released this image, the photograph of the whole Earth, which was the blue marble. image there as well. Stewart then went on to do Whole Earth Catalog and Long Now Foundation, a number of other things. Now, it would be important to say, though, even before the blue marble image is made public, but several years before, Buckminster Fuller, any number of others, had already sort of outlined in the spaceship Earth concept, which goes back all the way through the early 20th century. I think originally sort of coined by not the cosmists, but other early Russian physicists. So 1968, so the operating manual for spaceship Earth, Buckminster Fuller's 1968 Manifesto for a Unitary Planetary Planning Regime lends its name ultimately to this tourist attraction at Disney World by 1982. And so it goes. Now, on this question though of the orientation, now, there's another discussion we could have about what is the impact of this blue marble image and so forth and so on. But I want to take a particular position on this. It's well known that the image that Schmidt had originally taken out the window of the spacecraft, and the one that NASA had produced, looked more like this. It's one in which the South Pole was positioned above, quote unquote, Africa, which is the continent that you see here, but that the version that was publicly disseminated that we've had on all of our coffee mugs this whole time was deliberately rotated by NASA before it was released so that the southern hemisphere would be placed below the northern hemisphere according to mapping conventions and other primitive hierarchies, including from the Mercator, the standardization of the Mercator projection of where things are supposed to go and exactly who's on top of whom, who's a top and who's a bottom in the big scheme of things. At the same time, though, we would perhaps argue that to fully decolonize the blue marble image would not be to just unflip it, putting up and down back where they belong, but rather to affirm. I think the real sort of orientation would be to affirm and realize, perhaps in a snap, that all of these orientations are utterly arbitrary. There is no up and down in space. All of these traditions are feeble. All horizons are false. But that's not necessarily the way in which we come to think about these things, and it's not necessarily. Now, a little bit of an aside here. Looking in some of the work that I've been doing lately about this question of orientation within space design. So this is the inside of the International Space Station. And of course, it's rotating constantly. The up and downness of where things are within this can be extremely disorienting. And so what was established much earlier on was a system of arbitrary demarcation of up and downness within the space station, where certain things are always located above this, that there's sort of an arrow system, a color coding system, and so forth and so on, so that the astronauts can have a sense of ground and a sense of ceiling and of left and rightness in relationship to this kind of structure. There's another series of conversations which we will begin on Wednesday around the limits as we move outside of this planetary perch and are confronted with these and other disorientations. The limits of our relationship to that planetary condition become explicit. It's a making explicit of the ways in which we are grounded within this particular kind of location, and the basis and a capacity to measure the possible plasticity of ways to remake that as well. So, or as our friend Sun Ra put it, space is not only high, it's low. It's a bottomless pit. Now, here's my take on the blue marble. Schmidt himself, the guy who took the image around the window, he did not have so much of the overview effect. He did not have this spiritual awakening of the oneness of man. He kind of went in the other direction around this as well. Having spent his career on the ground back on Earth, becoming a senator from Alabama, and being one of the most active and vociferous climate change denialists in the US Senate for most of his career, famously equating the idea of climate change as sort of an excuse to implement National Socialism without any irony there as well. So maybe the question sort of asked is like, okay, what kind of overview effect did he have when he was up there? What happened to him? But I guess what I'm trying to indicate is that in the blue marble image, in comparing the blue marble image, the mechanism and means of its production and the cultural significance of it as an image, with the black star image, with the black hole image, as a kind of example A and example B. What forms of disenchantment and demystification do these images portend? That the fact that Schmidt ends up being who he ended up being should not in fact be so surprising to us, that the blue marble image in many ways always was a kind of creationist artifact. Now, we might wonder then how similar was the overview effect that Schmidt had of there to that experienced by William Anders. William Anders was the photographer of the Earthrise image. And so the Earthrise image is taken on the Apollo 8 mission. As the Apollo 8 crew orbits the moon, as they did, before they landed, and Anders comes out and takes the image, while they're landing, their mission is being broadcast live on television in Christmas Eve, 1968. Back on Earth, it's Christmas Eve. In space, it's not even anything. But it's Christmas Eve, 1968 on Earth, and as they do, they read from the book of Genesis.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness.
So this goes on for a while. The first forays off of Earth into space, ceremoniously dedicated to the principles of medieval creationism. We shouldn't be so surprised, I guess is my point, that despite the ubiquity of the globe as image, that the various solecisms of flat Earth worldviews continue to persist. And that is because the blue marble image itself was always already an image of geocentrism. Here's what I mean by that. Decades before this, Edmund Husserl, sort of the founding figure of phenomenology, there's a passage sort of written in the side of his notes on some sort of other thing, and this isn't something that I found in the archive. It's something else, but it's a passage that seems to be sort of very telling. He writes in the sort of the notes off to the side of his manuscript that the project of phenomenology, as he saw it ultimately, was to, quote, overthrow the Copernican theory in the usual interpretation of a worldview. Because it upset man from his early horizon, because it disorients our sense of place and horizon and intuitive comprehension of the world. Because the original arc, Earth, does not move. And so he's explicitly indicating that for him, that is the way to understand it, that the phenomenological project is one in which the intuitive perception of the world as it seems to be, as it appears to us to be, as it feels like it is, as it appears, the way in which it feels like that it appears to us, that the conceptual abstraction of that intuitive encounter with this encounter with this intuition is the function of this, is the function and purpose of this, of the phenomenological project itself. And I think, as you'll see, we will take him at his word. He goes on far to say that Galileo is not more true than Aristotle, as sort of later in this as well. And I actually don't disagree with him on this sort of point that at a fundamental level, that the phenomenological project is an anti-Copernican project, because it disorients the intuitive subject from its disorients the subject from its intuitive comprehensive of itself in the world and as the subject of the world, and also disorients the conflation of the world and the planet as the same thing. I agree with Husserl that that is in fact the basis of the phenomenological project, but it's also why, but we're just playing for the other team, I suppose. Yeah. Now, it echoes in a certain sense the, not in a certain sense, I think rather directly, the lament of Husserl's student, you know the dark story here, Heidegger, who in his 1938 lecture, The Age of the World Picture, sort of articulates and expands, I think, on this premise that Husserlian's notes sets in motion, and then he warns us explicitly against the kind of ontological and epistemological apocalypse that comes from how modern technical abstraction is capable of turning the world itself into an image, into a picture. Now, for Heidegger, this transformation of the world into a picture is also a kind of alienation of the experience of the world into the picture itself. There's the confusion of the image for the real that is part of the Platonic tradition going back some time, which is a spin and a little bit different from the ways in which Husserl differentiates. That's in fact, that the implications of the Copernican turn is that it disorients the subject from its ability to even reference itself in the world in relationship to how the world appears to it through the position of its own subjectivity. Heidegger, in a way, ups this ante by indicating that indeed that it's the image itself, and that the false totality of the image of the world as a picture per se, and particularly images of the world in its totality as a picture, that invites not only the illusion of the image, but also invites the confusion that comes with, therefore, understanding where we are right now in relationship to that bigger image. This is also scandalous for him. But the idea that the real problem here is how it is that we turn the world into a picture or make pictures of the world seems a bit quaint at a moment where the planet itself is actually making pictures, is itself a camera producing images of its own condition in ways we are just a sort of enabling mechanism here as well. 1966, so this is the same year of the craft lands on Venus, but around the time in which all those images of the lunar orbiter, of the Earth from outer space, and the lunar orbiter sending back these pictures, it's an interview with Heidegger, a famous interview in Der Spiegel, 1966, called Now Only a God Can Save Us, in which he says, they asked him about these images that he's sort of seen, because these are obviously a kind of like this is kind of a journalist's idea of a world picture. And he replied, I was certainly scared when I recently saw the photographs of the Earth taken from the moon. He thinks they were taken from the moon. They were taken from an orbiter around the moon, but close enough. He goes on to say, we don't need an atom bomb at all. The uprooting of human beings is already taken place by this imaging. This absolute annihilation of the orientation is what comes from this this kind of exteriorizing Copernican trauma. But what kind of human does he actually mean, and what kind of roots are they supposed to have had? He goes on to say, there are only technological conditions left. It is no longer an Earth on which humans live today. It is no longer an Earth on which humans live today, he says. And again, in a way, we agree with the premise, but find the conclusion elsewhere. It is indeed no longer, I would say, a world in the sense in which the givenness of a world within the phenomenological tradition appears. It is something else. It's a planet. So, indeed, we might put it differently and say it something like this. It is only through this escape, disorientation, disenchantment of geocentric intuition that we can have a planet at all. The Earth that is lost for Heidegger is one that had appeared in a kind of mystified aura as a singular, original, and central place, given by and for our being. And this is a key point, given by and for our experience of it. That the world that is there is knowable through our experience of it, and that is the horizon of this, that it is there for us to experience. So, still, even as these images of may have alarmed some phenomenologists, images like the blue marble, we're going to take it a step further, are at best the work, even these ones that scared them, I argue, are at best the work of a transitional humanism that did not and cannot truly decommission the vestigial anthropocentrism and anthropocentric self-regard and self-representation nearly enough. For that, we have to wait for the black hole image to appear, and a few more years for this to sink in. So let me shift then to this image in relationship to this as a kind of world picture. The black hole image is a kind of world picture, but it is crucially not a picture of Earth. It's rather a picture taken by Earth. It is not the world seen through the eyes of the human. It is the exterior condition of the planet as seen through the eyes of the planet. Rather, a picture taken by the Earth of its surroundings, for which we serve as a kind of essential enablers. Right? We were certainly part of this process. So, the way in which you might sort of imagine this as a kind of like rough scheme in your head is imagine the Earth as this sort of amoeba-like thing, wrapped in the wires of the Event Horizon Telescope array on one of its side. It develops this kind of artificial wiry crust on one side that is capable of sensing light. And at long last, in 2019, it opened its little eye and saw what was out there for the first time. It coordinated its little sensory cells, and it sees not just a space that it's empty, but it focuses on this little distant speck, a particular, highly particular distant speck in the distance of hyperdense blackness. And however unlikely that may be, that would be the first thing it sees is a black hole. The collected data then is of this happened. It does this. This amoeba does it. It produces this sensory information. Its sort of sensory cells are stimulated. All of this is aggregated by the tiny mammals who live inside the camera, who scurry around and render this into something that looks like a visible picture so that they can look at it and share it and try to make sense of it. This image is the opposite of what we would call a mirror. This was Stuart Brand's idea of what the blue marble, the Earth and the blue marble, the Earth from the outside would be like. It would be like finally being able to look in a mirror. This is, for us, the opposite of a mirror, but rather something in which we cannot ever be reflected. It's an abyss in which we can never be reflected. So while it's true that the planet folded itself to make those tiny mammals, and those tiny mammals think in a certain way, and so they made this mechanism according to the way in which they think in a certain way. We are part of this process for sure, an essential part of this process. It's not like the dogs and cats are going to be doing this anytime soon. Which to fold this Earth into an astronomical camera and so forth, the antecedent frameworks of our cognition are based on our ways of looking. The process reflected back in the image positions Homo sapiens as a kind of auto-generated smart bacteria swarming around on the surface of that amoeba, a transitive enabling layer. In the sensory data rendered into an image, we see this abyss in which we cannot see ourselves, but we can understand ourselves in it and through it. The unconscious star-sucking void is blind and deaf to our orientation. The black hole image is, in the best possible sense, a terrifying image. This is the pricelessness of this trauma. So to summarize it this way, in relation to comparing the two, this is not only in a way, I think what we're sort of proposing here is something quite different than the ways in which the blue marble, the logic of planetarity that is made clear through this is also quite different than, for example, the Gaia hypothesis, for which the planet is understood as a kind of homeostatic, ever-changing and kind of thermodynamic, but nevertheless a kind of homeostatic organism. It is what we understand here is instead is that entity is not only capable of its own forms of technicity and self-transformation, but it is in fact what it in ways may have been doing all along. So blue marble signaled a revitalized alloy of humanism and creationism. It's a picture made by a single human looking through the mirror and framing his sense of place, looking down from above. Then the black hole reveals a far more powerful inhuman scope and condition that defies articulation in the same way as it looks out, not only up, but out. So if the blue marble implied a global village in the terminology of the parlance of the times, by putting apex creationists in charge of the mythical garden, the black hole demands a very different kind of planetary regime, implies one at the very least, as it renders humans into a privileged mediating residue, one that sets in motion other forms of generalized planetary cognition. These two worlds, I think, could not be more different. But obviously, this profile will take a little bit of getting used to. Now, on the Copernican turn, the incompleteness of the Copernican turn, and again, I'm not really certain that the implications of heliocentrism have really percolated all the way down into the soil quite yet. The incompleteness of the Copernican turn attests to its difficulty and to its open-endedness. So if the first Copernican turn, that's literally Copernicus and Galileo, entailed a kind of disorientation of individual perception and interpretation, which is what upset Husserl. The apparently traveling sun is now understood to be still. It also implied a dismantling of long and slow dismantling of certain anthropocentric cosmological architectures that now heliocentrism is more or less common sense, regardless of whether you're an astronomer or not, and a disruptive shift in the geopolitical and geoeconomic architectures that drew legitimacy from previous models. E por se mueve, the Galileo supposedly utters at his trial, and yet it moves, right? They make him say the say the Earth is still and that everything goes around. He said, okay, fine, but and then mumbles under his breath, and yet it moves. Followed by Kant's critiques, Kant imagining himself to be taking the Copernican, his philosophy, his critique is being driven by the Copernican turn, though I would certainly suggest that that's not necessarily the case. Now, back to this point as I just introduced a few moments ago. The Copernican turn that is implied, the Copernican turn and the form of planetarity as that is implied by the black hole image, for example, means the reorganization of the Earth not only as it truly is, not only as this kind of relentless materialism, but also as it might be, how it might be recomposed. The Earth is not just as it is and sort of transforming itself within its own internal logic. It itself is capable of its own technicity, its own, the development of new forms of mediation, modeling, conception about itself. That's what the climate, that's what the Earth's, the apparatus that brought us the concept of climate change makes so. That's what the visual the photographic mechanism, the visual sensing mechanism that makes the black star possible. The traumatic difficulty then comes from our sort of evolutionary competence. That intuition, the cunning, the capacity for pattern recognition that comes from that we evolved with and through is also is a stubborn way of thinking. And includes the ability of complex forms of mutual cognition that allow for the mobilization of extraordinary forms of cooperation, even when those narratives that underlie that mutual cognition are arbitrary, as in the mythological systems, and include the durability of institutions that mediate their authority to enforce the cooperation through that. However, just as our own, as Homo sapiens, expanded cognition and agency developed coextensively with technologies. That is, our ability, the ways in which individually and as a species we think is not only the cause of our technical, the 3 million years or so of technical culture. That technical culture is also the cause of how it is that we think. This cognition and technicity being in a kind of coextensive circuit. This is sort of I refer you to Stiegler's early work as a starting point on this. The perceiving apparatuses would sometimes cause fundamental shifts. It would sometimes reveal an utterly counterintuitive reality in conflict with the model that enabled them, as we mentioned in the first place. That the model a reality that's in conflict with the model of the world that enabled them as technical innovations in the first place. So in this coextensive evolution, Homo sapiens technical culture, our ability to act upon the world and be acted upon the world through various forms of extensionality, repetition, solutions that become bounded into, and decisions that become fixed into artifacts that become tools, and so forth and so on. Produces not only a model of how to solve a unique problem, but produces models of how the world itself operates that produces these technologies. So again, I just want to reiterate the point here as we sort of, the definition then of the Copernican turn, of which we're trying to include the black hole image, is this. A conceptual model of the world develops a technical system in order to extend not only how it understands the world, but how it might act upon the world. But what is revealed about the world by that technical system undermines the conceptual model that made way for that technical system in the first place. Yeah. This becomes this basis of not only that disenchantment, but of a different model. Resistance to the surprising nature of this revelation and its implications in order to protect the integrity of the initial model is a tenacious adherence both to the familiarity of an idea or to the institutions that are dependent upon the idea, but it's also a tenacious adherence to a notion of the primacy of representation as such. Representations can resist interference by the represented. It is also permanent that it is coterminous with an approach that holds that, in essence, ultimately, that representations of the world are the thing that causes the world, more than the world is the thing that causes the representations, and that the contestation over what the world is and how the world be understood is a contestation over representations of the world. Because what this allows for is a notion that each representation is only a representation. That's just your opinion, man. That each representation is understood as essentially a representation that may be valued, contested, or understood per representation. The fact that the representation may be something that has or has not a greater or lesser correspondence to that which it represents is sidelined. So, as the Copernican turn is said, as Freud put it, to puncture human narcissism. This is Freud's term for this Copernican turn. This should be taken to mean not, and he's writing this roughly at the same time Husserl is writing a different angle. This should be taken to mean not only the stubborn self-centering, but also a dangerous adherence to the reflected image itself. And this is, I think, what the blue marble ended up doing. If so, then this would extend to the contemporary moment, it extends all the way to the contemporary moment in which representation is sometimes given this special status, by which it is seen as more likely to cause the represented than to be caused by it. Or in the parlance of post-structuralism, there is nothing outside the text. This is obviously in distinction to our the kind of materialism we're interested in. So it extends to the notion that technology, and let's think of it in terms of what the implication is this for an understanding of technology, and in particular its relation to ecology. This also sets in motion and is validated then by the notion that an understanding of technology as something that always essentially reflects, absorbs, or otherwise discursively represents human culture more than they are things that shape human culture and by which culture operates. That the criticism of technology, that the approach to a historicization of technology, that the philosophy and a critical of technology is primarily then grounded in the notion that at its core, technology is a representation, is essentially an absorption or representation of a already existing and ultimately more foundational and more fundamental discursive operation. That it is a sociomorphic phenomenon, not anthropomorphic, but sociomorphic. That it simply represents society, and so it is to be criticized on those terms. Okay, so last point, and then we'll open this up for some discussion. Instead, we should look at through the black hole image and back at ourselves, seen not in its reflection, but from an outside that would always precede us. The whole operated apparatus that we designed, and which designs us in turn, looks back onto the Earth's surface and asks the question that drives our program: where should the cities go? So let me, we'll leave it there for this first discussion. Then now we can actually get to the more interesting part, which would be the discussion of some of the things that we've laid on the table here as well. So in terms of an invitation towards that, please, the kinds of questions or comments that we begin here can be big picture things, very specific things related to the sort of scope and direction of the program. Any of these are acceptable. The quality of the seminar is basically dependent on the quality of the conversation that we develop here, and so I would want to give the most open possible invitation for the more perspectives on these topics. Please, yeah.
Is it on? Yeah, okay. So I was thinking, so this is going to be a bit messy, and I apologize, but I'm trying to put a few things together.
Good.
First, for me, like, there is this idea of the decolonization of the blue marble regarding its matter of orientation, right? So, of course, like, there is no, these are arbitrary, and there is no up and down. I agree with that, but for me, like, pragmatically, that is not enough. Like, to say that it's not enough in terms of, like, the project that we need to go on doing it. First, because, I mean, we are not starting from this kind of level playing field. So this kind of orientation is already in place, and there is kind of a deconstruction maybe that is needed to do. Mm-hmm. Which only repeating the idea or like discursively affirming that orientations are arbitrary, I don't see that like going very far in terms of an actual outcome.
I think I go to your question. Let me. We can go back and forth. The most explicitly was to finally decolonize the image. The premise is not simply that by dismissing this history of geographic orientation between the North and the South is possible to get rid of with simply this kind of that quickly. This isn't what I meant to imply really at all. In a way, I was sort of presuming that the first process of that decolonization of the image would be one in which the arbitrary conventions of the ways in which the conventions of those orientations are deeply built into the mechanisms with which we're working is always available to the sort of challenge and reconstruction and redevelopment. That's essentially necessary. The final, beyond this, which I guess are sort of things like beyond was sort of what we would already presume as this kind of process around this sort of as well. Beyond simply fixing the mechanism on its own terms of inverting and reverting and turning what's upside down right side up, turning in this reorientation. There's in fact that there's a more fundamental. There's a more fundamental insight, a more fundamental notion at play here that has to do not just with orientation here, but also with the possibility of what the scope of that rearrangement in fact may be. That denaturalizing process. There's essentially sort of the two layers of this. There's the denaturalization of the Mercator projection, and I think that the denaturalization of the Mercator projection is something that things like the story of the blue marble image makes explicit. Then there's the denaturalization of these kinds of orientation projection as such. The question that's implied by this is not, the question implied by this is, once it becomes utterly clear that those orientations are arbitrary, what would be the cartography, what would be the cartographic imagination by which we and the rest of the planet understands and imagines and maps itself, that would account for both of these. That would account for both of these kinds of moments, given the fact that those conventions are structured re-arbitrary. And I would be the first to suggest that the specification of that cartography is one that is part and parcel with that project of the plan, as we've been calling it, and sort of an understanding of where those sort of relationships would sort of go. So I'm not at all suggesting that we could start from this tabula rasa. What I am suggesting is that in a way that it's also not enough to simply invert the semiotics of the colonial era and think we're done. The issue then is essentially what comes now. Yeah.
Okay, but just I get everything, like I understand that, but what I was thinking actually was just a little bit before that. So before the main question, I was thinking. So you showed the image of the spaceship where there's no orientation, and of course everything is all around. And because we're dealing with this kind of huge deep time black hole kind of thing, I was thinking also on how gravity then has a very direct relationship with our orientation.
Absolutely.
And how, and I'm not sure if this is a question or, I mean, just a comment. So how would it be kind of like a Copernican turn in regards of this disorientation in relation to gravity? So for instance, I'm thinking on like the experience, like we're not easily bound to have this kind of experience of not having an up and down unless we're all promoting like going out of space or I don't know, sensory deprivation chambers or something like this.
Yeah, no, I think I sort of follow the point. So just to be sort of clear, in the International Space Station, they introduced an artificial up, down, left, and right within the system, so that there would be this reorientation. There still isn't the gravity, and so there's still this sort of delinking of down with gravity. There isn't more gravity down. Down is just another. It's just another direction in which this sort of goes, and this is inevitably a kind of disorientation, and that for some it's actually much more ecstatic experience than the so-called overview effect, this feeling of weightlessness in relation.
I think my question is actually that, like, if that's kind of a more promising framework actually to which to think through, then
it could be.
Just turning it.
I think there's probably several, and that's why I'm trying to invite several. I think that this subtraction of ground is actually quite significant, and the suggestion of groundedness, and the subtraction of the idea that the ground and the intuitive horizon that is afforded by ground, which is the basis of the phenomenological common sense, that the subtraction of this ground, and yet the world remains, and yet reality persists without this in this as well, is exactly, I think you're sort of onto it, is the kind of moment or the kind of disclosure that should make more explicit what is and is not the basis of those the limit conditions of our predicament, but also, and as I'll talk a little bit more later, is one in which the space station and the space station itself should also make clear to a certain extent how utterly dependent we are on the technical arrangements with which we are connected for the viability of our lives and organisms. And so on the one hand, I think what's made clear is the fact is how much we evolved as what makes clear is how much we really are Earthlings. That in terms of our orientation of gravity, oriented horizon, the uprightness, the spinal perception, the spinal sort of structure in this as well. And so in the incremental subtraction of those things that constrain and define and produce this status as such, that condition is both made more clear, and then there's an invitation towards some form of plasticity there, some kind of extension or reformation of this as well, because that additional revelation is that we're utterly dependent on this technical apparatus. The technical apparatus is modifiable, and through its modifiability, we are made modifiable too. And so we'll be doing a fair bit of discussion around this. So one of the other people that were on the online people, Rachel Hill, is doing a lot of work on exactly this question, these sorts of forms of orientation and disorientation within space. And
What's her name?
Rachel Hill. You'll meet her in a moment, or not today, but a bit later on, around these kinds of questions. So yes, I think there's lots of sort of starting points into this as well. I mean, if it makes more sense to you to kind of start with the first person singular disorientation rather than the cartographic, is fine. I mean, I think they all will align eventually. Yeah. Yeah, please.
I was interested in getting a bit more into the, I think there's a lot of talk about the disenchantment of anthropocentrism. Would it be fair to say that, I don't think it's a term necessarily that you use, but that a starting point is a sort of anti-human centrism? No.
No, like I say, some of my best friends are humans. It's not there isn't a misanthropic aspect of this as well. And I think this is a way in which I would differentiate some of this from positions that are based on a critique of anthropocentrism, but which are, in a certain way, more anti-human, either explicitly in the case of some forms of deep ecology, or in a more implicit way in which there's a question that there has to be some that the project now is basically a kind of withdrawal of the species from the rest of the territories, and sort of in one way or another. So, but specify your question a little bit more in terms of what. In terms of how you, I can see a few different valences for what you're asking. I want to make sure I answer the question that you actually mean.
Yeah, I guess in a way there's the talk about the disenchantment of anthropocentrism, or to a certain extent maybe human centrism, this idea that like the world is here for us and that we are the most important thing in the world, is something that up until this point seems counterproductive to the project, but in a way that sounds to me like we need to take ourselves slightly out of the center, yet perhaps we actually need to put us further into the center to actually.
Well, this is a little bit what I was trying to sketch out a little bit with this point a bit earlier on about the Copernican turn, actually sort of something that paradoxically implying perhaps a greater degree of agency in certain sort of ways as well. I think again it's the idea that I think through some of these forms of what we might call disenchantment or sort of revelations is that it's not. It depends. There's maybe a few things that are possibly being disenchanted depending on your starting point. One might be the sense that the world is there for us in the acquisitive, extractive sense. That man is not an animal, man has dominion over the beasts, and so forth and so on. But there's also the sense, and this is what the link I was trying to make between that and the phenomenological tradition, is the idea that the world is here for us to experience. Not that it's simply here from some sort of creationist dominion, but rather that our experience of the world, and indeed our experience of the world, is a fundamental ideal, that it is the basis of a proper philosophical exploration, as it might be for phenomenology, but that it also is a transcendental good that should be cultivated in all times in terms of what we call art. And part of the argument is both that understanding that our experience of the world is part of the anthropocentrism and needs some sort of the critique. But there's also another argument we'll make later about why that's actually the most ecologically expensive of our pursuits. That technoscience is cheap compared to meaning and meaningfulness. Yeah, but to the other sort of thing about this recentering thing, because this is a kind of the key point. Think of it in terms of something like the Event Horizon Telescope. We made that. right? It wasn't the dogs and cats. It wasn't just things where like we sort of things that made this, but through this figure of the apex mediating residue sort of thing as well. It's more that we come to see ourselves as having an important and critical and irreducible position in the composition of this apparatus, but one that is actually far larger than our scale, far larger than our initiative, far larger than our industry, and that the ultimate outcome and function of this thing that we have set in motion is something like the planet being able to augment its own technicity to perceive its own structure around this as well. That we maybe in this way. So there maybe, I mean, in a simple way, there's a difference between withdrawing from a position of protagonist and somehow abdicating the forms of agency that and capacities for technical and cognitive abstraction and means and industry and making things and knowing things and so forth and so on that we as a species have been uniquely good at for the last 3 million years, really 60,000 years or so, but 3 million years of the technical culture. And so I guess it's paradoxical in sort of the one sense in that I think what it implies is for the composition of that viable planetarity to even be possible, we have to understand that our experience of the world is not a transcendental ideal that we sort of move into this with. For the composition of that viable planetarity to be possible, we have to actually properly understand our role within these kinds of cascades that we set in motion, so that we can set them in motion. Not so that we can do nothing or not set them in motion, or a kind of or other forms of withdrawal from that. Is that clear? I want to find a way to. I'd like to explain this in a way that doesn't seem paradoxical, but since sort of the common sense about the critique of anthropocentrism, it almost immediately implies the idea that, therefore, there is a sort of withdrawal from certain forms of hubris, but not others. And I guess I'm also saying is that that's backwards too.
Right. And this is maybe something that is better to get into later once we actually get to the idea of like the ecological cost of science versus culture. But I was looking up just the cost to a certain extent. I mean, not the ecological cost, which is maybe something I should look further into, but the cost to a certain extent of the black hole image itself, which from what I found was about 5 petabytes of data and cost about $50 to $60 million to create. That seems like a significant cost for potentially, depending on how much it will eventually differ from the blue marble as in its significance. I mean, arguably science, but also arguably a cultural image.
$50 million. I'm just thinking.
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking about like
if the Dodgers trade for Mookie Betts goes through, like how much they're going to pay him next year to play center field. $50 million for the planet instrumentalizing itself so that it might perceive its circumstance seems to me quite low. In terms of, quite reasonable, actually. I'll take 2.
But it depends on its actual effect versus its hopeful. For you it had its effect, but similarly to the overview effect, whether it will stay a theoretical effect or will not potentially reach that potential.
Yeah. I mean, it's something. I mean, I'm not trying to just totally dismiss the idea that the blue marble and the image. I mean, I think it is the basic idea is true that that as a kind of icon of the ecological movement, that the blue marble image had this function, had this sort of central semiotic function as a kind of orientation. I think all of this is probably true and not all negative, but I'm trying to sort of make a point with this as well. So I think the implication of the black. I mean, I'm trying to outline what I think some of the implications of the black hole image could be, and maybe to a certain extent what they should be, if we were to seek out the trauma that is implied within that, and through the seeking out of this trauma, to find again this reorientation of our position within these cascades of assemblage that would allow for the possibility of that viable planetarity. That there is a sort of shift in the sense of subject and agency within this as well, but it's a level of a species level rather than of an individual subject, as it would be for the phenomenologist. And so I'm trying to make a case for why make sure we don't waste the money, I guess. But I think your point is like $50 million is this. This is really cheap considering what it is.
The petabytes that are to remain, but
maybe you should compare it to a movie, Interstellar.
No, I get. I mean, the monetary. Yeah.
So if you think about Interstellar, we have a nice movie, 3 hours, but no scientific meaning attached to it. There.
I don't know. I see. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi. So 2 questions.
Please.
First, a quick one. Can you please give me your definition, or just explain a little bit what you understand by agency when you say that automation is that through which agency and movement cascade?
Not quickly. There's a quick version. There's a quick version of it. There's a quick version of it, and then there's a proper version of it, sort of in this sort of this thing as well. As I'll talk a little bit more about this as well, the notion of agency that we're looking for and we're trying to identify within this understanding of this integration of the technical and the ecological within this as well is not a kind of first mover agency. Maybe it'd be helpful to describe in terms of what I don't mean. What I don't mean is the agents of that there's a pre-formulated intention that is understood, desired within a encapsulated subject that is expressed or externalized in some sort of way in which that the intention or desire of the agent is then made real through this kind of process. I'm not against this. I just think it just as a definition, as a descriptive definition of the ways in which agency actually sort of works in the world, it's much more the exception than the rule. And so understanding this sort of process, first of all, I think this process of automation that we're sort of talking about here is one in which we ask the question of what's being automated. What are we automating exactly within the kind of process? Automation in this sense, I mean it more in terms of again, we did a whole discussion of this, but I mean this more in terms of the context of the repetition of a decision or solution or concept in such a way that that decision does not need to be remade over and over and over and over again. It can be concretized or artifactualized or encoded within the relay such that when that same condition emerges, that the decision in essence is already pre-made, it's already pre-structured. In terms of this automation, which is not which is different in the sense of the notion of automation in terms of autonomy. Right? It's not that these things are autonomous. They're in fact not autonomous at all in the sense that what appears to us as being autonomous is actually the result of lots of precedent decisions that have already been set in place around this structure sort of work as well. Now, decisions don't always repeat. Decisions don't always repeat through these kinds of things. That the repetition of something through sort of the system. This is how we make something on the assembly line. This is how the water cascades through the ground of the forest in some sort of way. That this decision sort of be coded in this way is in a process of transformation. Is in a process of change at a sort of point in time. That there's inevitably reverberations and perturbations and shifts and cracks within those kinds of dynamics. Sometimes the decisions or the mechanisms are repeated, and sometimes they're not. So I guess the ways in which I would define agency within the structure is at least in 2 ways. One is positions within those cascades by which contingent decisions are not only allowed for, but which are sort of built into the logic of the system. So if you have 100 nodes within a system, let's say, there might be 5 within that system that, in terms of the way the system is designed, 95 of them, those decisions are, in essence, pre-decided so that they can be predictable, right? That when I turn the doorknob, it always opens. I know what's going on. I don't have to decide what happens or something. It's decided. But there's 5 in which that there is, by the system design, that there's a contingency, that the decisions are necessarily need to be taking place over and over and over and over and over again. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe there's 95 in which there's the contingent decisions and 5 in which there's a certain form of automation within this as well. Regardless, I would want to sort of think of the agency less in terms of this sort of self-encapsulated will and more in terms of these moments within the larger unfolding cascading network by which some capacity for not only for steerage is possible, but for some form of some form of new decision is possible within the sort of system. Some form of forking or consolidation or transformation within larger apparatuses is possible. And sometimes there may be sort of a position where there's something sort of supposed to be automated that actually becomes this kind of structure. So I guess in this sense, the agency would refer to those sort of processes by which that cascades are interrupted. The cascades are set in a different motion. Cascades are originated, innovated, resisted in one way or another. In one way or another.
Because to me, it kind of sounds like you're saying it's okay, contingent. I think in the book you use the phrase projective encounter, so it's kind of like a contingent projective encounter between the subject and object, or between. Would you say that? Like, would you still kind of collapse it on the idea of the subject, even if you do not say that it's a kind of subjective expression of will? The encounter, because the encounter has to be or.
No, I wouldn't put it necessarily. I mean, I wouldn't say that it cannot be in the subject. It can, but I definitely would. I definitely would sort of understand within this framework, the agency as a position, rather than something that is bound up with a particular subject. So the train train engineer has agency over the rest of the train that is quite different than everyone else on the train. But it's because that person has the position of the engineer. It is not because that particular person, Jeff, subjectively, uniquely is given this agency by the rest of the train apparatus. Rather, the position of the pilot within this as well. So those positions can be occupied by persons, individual persons. They can be occupied by groups of people. But more often they're not occupied by humans at all. They're occupied by other kinds of contingent apparatuses, contingent mechanisms.
Okay, so the second question.
Yeah.
Going back to the idea of science versus culture, but not necessarily like the material costs.
Yeah, I mean, it's an arbitrary definition. It's a polemic point, but sure.
But what I'm thinking is the cultural narratives, the kind of the individuated cultural narratives that we now consider to be like the pitfalls, right, of the society. Because they came out of the same philosophical paradigm that the science kind of was conceptualized into as well. As in the idea, again, going back to the idea of the expression of individual or even collective will, and going back to Descartes, like I think therefore I am. So there's a separation between me, the subject, and the world, the empirical world around me. And so going through like Locke and then to Kant, the idea of like noumena, and then coming to phenomenologists themselves. And so the idea, even the material, the natural sciences, right, kind of grew out of the same things that the cultural narrative that we are now trying to blame in the book. So are we sure we're going to kind of separate them?
Okay, so there's a lot of things going on. A lot of interesting things sort of in this as well. So first of all, the distinction between the ecological costs of the science versus ecological costs of culture. Again, just to be clear, I'm meaning this more as a kind of polemic provocation, but for a particular purpose, and that the sense in which it is that as a, I think, far more defensible, if also contrarian viewpoint that would hold more conventionally that the real cause of the Anthropocene is techno-scientific hubris, and that what is most innocent in this process is direct lived experience and the affective experience of direct lived experience, and that's the part which needs to be most protected and amplified against this reduction of the world to a techno-scientific rational reason, so forth and so on. The Neo-Frankfurt School sort of common sense by which sort of work with this as well. Now, it's not that there's nothing to this. It's not that there isn't that this is sort of completely wrong. But it is also sort of true that the bigger question of what do we use planetary scale computation for? What is it for? We've built the stack. It is capable of incomprehensibly vast amounts of calculation and storage and so forth and so on. We can look at the charts. The number of, Mark probably knows, the amount of information that goes through the entire apparatus on a particular day, the amount of information that any individual person produces or consumes in a particular day, and so on and so on. It is this huge geologic and physical cost, from extracting of the minerals, the metals, the subterranean, the energy cost, the building of these things, the water cooling cost, the devices, and so this enormous cost. What are we using it for? What is it being used for? The things that it's being used for to do things like the black hole image, climate science, other forms of systemic modeling, the kinds of things that would be identified most explicitly as forms of global scale techno-scientific initiatives, are in many ways really not only not the most, in many ways the least expensive of all the sort of things that we're looking for, but it's also a way to sort of draw this distinction, sort of making that we're using planetary scale computation for all the wrong things, namely being used for this mechanism for the amplification of arbitrary significance, and also the and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is the intensive over-individuation of the way in which that apparatus models the world itself, which we see in the ways in which large-scale platforms identify primarily the world through individual profiles. I've got a profile with Google, you've got a profile with Google, you've profiled Instagram, Amazon, the rest of this is sort of this as well. The way in which we have trained the planetary scale computational apparatus to see the world is primarily to see the world as 7 billion individual Homo sapiens whose subjective sense of interest, will, and desire can be modeled and predicted. And the more that we tune this apparatus to accommodate the visual and consumptive desire of these over-individuated subjective profile units, the better. This is, at the most fundamental sense, a misuse of this apparatus. And there needs to be a fundamental de-anthropocentrism of planetary scale computation, but that anthropocentrism more specifically a kind of disindividuation of the ways of the objective knowledge of this computational kind of structure of this as well. So that's the point. Now, you're absolutely true that within a trajectory of the post-Cartesian Enlightenment sort of project, that even the distinction itself between scientific inquiry and cultural inquiry itself has this particular sort of momentary kind of structural condition in terms of what constitutes the formation of relationship to subject, and even the idea of subject and object as being the mechanism through which we would orient these kinds of things within a sort of point in time. But that's really I would sort of make that that's actually a very recent kind of quirk over taking the 60,000 year view from when the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cortex linked up and became really capable of forms of abstractive thought, that sort of distinction is actually is more of a sort of local quirk. The fact that it's also a primarily Western European history around which is sort of social, is also part of the contingency of this sort of approach. Science, to me, science is a method. It's a method. It's not a subject matter. Molecules and cells and atoms are not science. It's the world, the planet. Matter is there. Science is a method by which there's sort of ways of testing hypotheses about the properties of this exterior kinds of things. But this understanding of the planetary processes that we're interested in and of itself is itself not defined by that, should not be defined by that method. It long precedes this kind of structure sort of as well. And I would also sort of suggest that one of the ways in which the Copernican trauma that has cascaded since that point in time, that really sort of begins with Copernicus and Darwin, so the rest of it sort of goes through as well. The part of the implication of this is a clear collapsing of some of those Cartesian conceits. In fact, that's in a way in which the collapsing of some of these Cartesian conceits is maybe also a sub-definition of these Copernican traumas in the first place. That the knowing subject who is doing this deductive or inductive process is fundamentally separate from the process itself that they're sort of doing, is a very different idea than the Earth folds itself in particular ways and organizes matter in particular ways. That sometimes that matter is capable of feats of cognition, and that can happen in Homo sapiens or dogs and cats and dolphins and AI and whatever. Matter can think. We are thinking matter. We are matter thinking about matter. In this way, it is not really a Cartesian sort of structural kind of sort of approach.
What about object-oriented ontology?
I'm sorry?
Object-oriented ontology, AAA.
What's the question?
Like, what is your personal view, or would you say that we should lean more towards that then?
So we made there's a lot of direct links between some of the things, the ways in which we'll be approaching this question of materiality and the question of our co-organization and co-construction with this materiality, with the broader area of what we would call speculative realism. If you want to draw links between this and that and another, by all means, go ahead in this way as well. I think that there's probably, the approach that we're taking is more in line with the vector that went in a different direction with Ray Brossier and Reza Negarestani than the direction that went with sort of the Graham Harman and sort of Ian Boga sort of direction. And there's a longer discussion like why that would sort of be as well. Long story short on OOO, and I know Graham well, we're both at SciArt sort of together. I honestly think OOO is not particularly interested in objects. I think it's interested in nouns. I think that the reduction of things, that everything becomes an object, everything sort of things as well. I think the interest in like how do objects resist one another? How do they bounce against each other? How do they, when you take something and you break it in two, is it two objects or is it one object? Or the fact that everything that can be posited by the sort of the most introductory sort of readings of OOO could have been deduced before organic and inorganic chemistry, when we actually began to understand how molecular bonds work and how objects actually are. And most of what we know about material science and so forth and so on indicates to me that in ways it's meant to be much more of a kind of, it doesn't actually make good on its claim to have surpassed the linguistic turn. I think it's actually all about a linguistification of objects.
Thank you.
But there's a longer discussion on this.
Hello.
Hi.
I have several questions. I'm trying to don't get in very messy. You in a way describe a cascade of preconditions for the process of project to happen. Like disorientation is a precondition for arbitrariness, then arbitrariness is a precondition of the possibility of design, or in a way the possibility of design of configuring discourses around the products of this mediation, which is the design in itself and the process of design. So on one hand, there's the possible products emergent from the information produced by technology, for example, event horizon. And on the other, there's a transformation of it as a mediatized signifier, the black hole image. So I have two questions. One related to the broadcasting of the image, and one on how does the image relates to unease, the idea of unease. So the first one, how black hole image was broadcasted, like if there's a record of its production as a fiction based on scientific imagery, as the case in Blue Marble.
Yeah, and you're gonna meet, well, when we go to, yes, when we're on our trip to Cambridge, we'll hopefully meet some of the people who are involved in the project.
Oh. Okay, great. So I guess in a way it was intentional, and it was like
intentional.
biased.
It was highly intentional.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have to wait like 2 months for the
No.
answer.
If you want, if there's a more specific question, I might.
Oh yeah,
not
yeah,
answer,
yeah.
But I might not. They may be the one to talk to.
If this, the veracity or the hyper-reality of these images is related in a way to the idea of uncannily functionalism and like extreme constraints. Like if those ideas parallel in a way, or how they do.
Okay. So the first one was extreme constraints, and the first one was the hyperfunctionalism?
Yeah.
Right. There's certain, I mean, I suppose that we have a way of, the history of the image, the history of vision evolved many times. On the planet began, there wasn't one animal that had the first eyes, and all of its children had eyes after that. The history by which chemoreceptor cells turned into photoreceptor cells goes back to, amoeba in the ocean trying to figure out which way is up, and it evolved in lots of different kinds of constructions. The history of artificial vision, how it is that we could cook matter to fold it in such a way that would produce surfaces that would respond to light, to capture something, that the transformation of the surface and its relationship to light would result in something that reminds us of what we might do with pigments on a surface in one way or another. The way we understood, because of that particular contingent arbitrary media history, we understood photographs as a kind of automation of painting. It was not how not necessarily the only way in which this could work, or the way in which this could be understood. Some of those principles, like the scale of aperture, the resolution of the structure, and that capacity for understanding the structure of the artificial image, in order to produce this, what we still allegorically call a camera, the Event Horizon Telescope is this giant camera. It's not a camera. It's nothing like this. It structure as well. Has very specific kinds of constraints, very specific kinds of technical and astronomic requirements in order for us to be able to record the trace of photons from 53 million years ago. It's a highly constrained image. It's not like pointing your phone at something and you get what you get. The constraints were this enormous sort of part of this as well. Now, to the extent that it is an uncanny image, to the extent that it's a terrifying image, to the extent that it is an image that may suggest this kind of the forms of trauma and reorientation of our understanding within these kind of structures. Sort of the case is, it seems to me quite obviously a result of the almost incomprehensibly unlikely fact that light that came from a black hole millions of light years away would result in that JPEG that you see in front of you right here and right here, right now. Of all of the things that could have happened, the fact that this fact sort of did is part of the galaxy brain logic moments of the image. So I don't know if I think I'm answering sort of your question in this sort of way. Does it seem obscure to you how the extraordinary constraints of the possibility of this image are preconditions for the significance of the image? Because to me, they're so tightly wound. It seems kind of obvious.
Yeah, I wasn't referring to the technical constraints, but the design of its constraints in terms of project for further interpretations to come. Like, for example,
what are the constraints for the interpretation? I see.
Exactly, like that image is, as you said.
Well, I think it goes to her question, which she sort of left. I mean, the constraints. I think part of the history that she speaks to of the absent agent.
Oh, I get it.
Within and the contingency as well, is that the incorporation of the significance of that trauma and that reorientation of the position of our species in relation to that, and the reorientation of that in relation to the possibilities of the viable planetarity is not something that comes tabula rasa. The constraints is this is at the very least this scope and weight of the historical circumstance of the first terraforming in which we find ourselves. That's part of this. I mean, those are the arbitrary orientations of up and down are not are exactly central to the historical terraforming in which we find ourselves. That was the map of the first terraforming, that it was the Anthropocene, the Mercator projection. And so the reorientation, the disorientation is also a reorientation. The project to come is the reorientation from the disorientation. This entirety of this context is part of the constraints, it would sort of seem to me. I mean, in the big picture, unless you had a more specific.
No, okay.
A way to specify them further, be happy to. You know. Yep.
Hi. So we're talking a little bit how Anthropocene is not only already causing a terraforming, but a bottom-up terraforming. So I'm wondering if...
Planless, at the very least. Planless.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm wondering if it's a given, or at least a possibility, that a top-down system is preferred. And if so, if that wouldn't shift the technical preceding the political thinking that if there isn't a paradox within that.
I don't think so. I'm not sure that I would be how comfortable I am with totally linking the idea of the plan to top down as we normally think about it, or of completely congratulating the previous previous Anthropocene for being entirely bottom up. I think that there's probably a limit. Very quickly we get to the limit of that these two orientations themselves are way too low resolution to really describe the kind of orientation that we actually need there as well. I think part of it, where this may link to this notion of the geonomos to a certain sense. I mean, this should sort of, in a certain sense, sort of go without saying, but that the part of the condition of the condition of the planetarity that there's a precedent universal. Is that there is no, there's no outside, there's no over there. That there, in fact, that the 7 billion of us are all in the same spot, right? That this planetary perch is a condition of cohabitation, and that condition implies a form of it implies a form of potentially some sort of form of a geopolitical integration, but there may be other ways. I mean, there's other sort of arguments against it, but it certainly not only implies, but actually guarantees or even defines an ecological integration around these questions. This as well. I don't think that would preclude the idea of the geotechnical as the basis of the geopolitical. But again, and I'll talk a little bit about this in terms of energy infrastructure tomorrow, but that premise, that notion really boils down to simply this, is that it is clear that the geochemical transformation of the carbon removal is only one part of the process. There's also biodiversity and all kinds of other things as well. But that if we're just focusing on this, that the climate structure, there needs to be a transformation in planetary geochemistry. The parts per million of carbon dioxide molecules trapped within the atmosphere is too much heat, there needs to be less. Okay. In a certain sense, whether the good guys or the bad guys do that, whether that's done by the red team or the blue team, whether that's done by humans or the cats and dogs, in a certain sense, is irrelevant to the specific question of the transformation in the planetary geochemistry kind of structure of this as well, or at least that shift itself is in a way is not the same thing as the sort of the political kind of instance or agency of this as well. And I think that part of it is that one of the ways in which we've learned to understand and learned to sort of think through the question sort of what happens does have to do with a certain extent of a notion of agency in relationship to this that perhaps is too much in the sense of an understanding of agency as the expression of of sort of an individual or collective aspiration or desire for outcome. That things happen in the world because we thought them. Because we represented them and conceptualized them. The representation causes the real in a certain kind of structure of this as well. Now, I would argue that, there's another who would argue that in the history of technology, that there's a much more defensible position to argue that that complex transformations within technical infrastructures ended up producing societies and cultures and economics that were necessary in order to be organized in relationship to those technical systems. That's Marx's base superstructure is one version of this argument, but there's other. But you don't have to sort of necessarily accept all the implications of that. Now, but we're talking about something that's not about the past, but it's sort of about the future. Clearly, there needs to be this transformation in planetary geochemistry, and that is just a matter of the molecules. You can call it science, you can call it culture, you can call it anything you want. It's just the indifferent molecular relationship and too much heat around this as well. The mechanisms that would be necessary to both to absorb and withdraw and contain the already existing heat that's sort of already there, and to replace the infrastructures that we already have, which we'll be sort of talking a little bit more about, the geotechnology that is needed. I don't think it's possible to deploy the geotechnology that is needed with our current political and economic and cultural system. It's not possible for any number of reasons. It has to do with jurisdictional structures. It also has to do with this reliance on the sort of the transference of general will through this system and an understanding of agency as the first domino pusher through this kind of structure. I don't think it's possible to sort of to try to sort of do this, which would put us at odds with a few sides of sort of this as well. Now, there are also those there are many of those who on the left, colleagues of ours who would agree with this point and argue therefore we need a fundamental transformation in the political, culture, and economic infrastructure so that this geotechnological apparatus becomes possible to sort of deal with. Fine. To the extent to which it's I want to introduce an additional possibility, which is perhaps that geotechnological apparatus appears first, and the political, economic, and cultural transformation that is needed appears because there is no way to govern and organize that technological infrastructure other than through the political, cultural, and economic mechanisms that are capable of doing so. And I think that is, in a certain sense, the historical part of the historical precedent, right? This would also put us at odds. That to some extent puts that position to some extent at odds with some of those who have deeper commitments to what I would consider a political reductionist standpoint. That the entire world can be conceptualized really fundamentally through explicit or implicit dynamics of power relations within one species. I don't think the accumulation of molecules in the atmosphere really cares about that enough. Second, it would put us at odds with a sort of conventional eco-modernist position, which in a basic sense would argue that, yes, really that this transformation that needs to take place is ultimately a geotechnological transformation, but that we can have that geotechnological transformation while keeping the political, economic, and cultural system that we already have, no problem. The position I would put forward is like, no, we can't. That not only just the political, but there is no way in which the geotechnological system we have can take place, can be steered, can be organized, can be governed, can be planned with the means that we have. There's no way in which you can get that without the other.
So my question is about the visual representations.
Yeah.
So when the highest resolution possible representation of the Earth is no longer the world, so what us, the terraforming, should it? Yeah. So what do we expect from the high resolution media? From what this project is expecting to see?
Sure.
So because in this morning we have been talking about this visual representation of the world, this and that.
Yeah.
But now the highest resolution media available here is no longer about the Earth. It's no longer the world. So we don't really see the world anymore from the highest resolution media. From the black hole is not. That's not the world anymore. So what do we expect to produce as the outcome from this program? Because you want to produce something with the high resolution media, right?
Not necessarily. To me, the highest resolution media for the articulation of concepts is still writing.
Yeah. So
in terms of really the most resolution version of a concept, no, I'm not. If you're,
yeah,
we don't. It's not 8K video more better than 4K video.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
That's not the plan at all.
Yeah.
No.
And also, I want to
if that's what you're asking. Yeah.
No. The next note, and it leads to my actual question is what kind of lens are you using when you're saying when we look back onto the Earth and look at the cities? Are you using the lens of church lens, seeing the metabolism? No, the microorganism kind of Earth, or what kind of lens are you using? What do you expect to see? Should we see cities as pixels or what?
I don't know that it's necessarily. I think there's a point. It's an interesting question. I don't know that looking back on the Earth from the outside, basically the thing that frightened Husserl, this frightened Husserl and Heidegger so much. It's the perspectival outside that I think we're talking about here. Is this as well? There's ways in which that outsideness is that he identified, and that we sort of tracing the genealogy of this is very much about the visual, the visual representation of the Earth of this. And I know in UC's Perica's seminar coming up, he's going to be talking a lot about these visual representations of the Earth around this, and this as well. But I think in terms of this question of this conceptualization of the outside from where the cities go around this as well, I don't know that this necessarily needs to be understood entirely as a process that is only mediated through the image, or that it is an image that would structure this question. I think it is one that would be sort of external, but I think there's another way of understanding what the dynamic of those positions would be, other than just through the picture. But if there's a more, I get a sense there's actually more specific question that you're looking at. Your mention of Churchland and the microorganisms suggests that you have an idea that you.
Yeah, because when I'm reading the book, and also when you're talking about we have been talking about how these kind of cameras, lens, or whatever technical stuff we're using to produce this visual representation of the world, the Earth.
Oh, I see, with the projects. Yeah.
But and then at the end you start to imagine the Earth as a moa or something, a microorganism.
Yeah.
So I wonder how is that the turn. I just find it very interesting, and I wonder like which direction should we go when we like think of the visual representation of this. Yeah.
There's lots of different kinds of cameras to work with. So if you want to do it use entirely microscopes for the project, we can talk around this sort of as well. So, but I think the question of this, the cinematic logic of the ways which we're sort of bending the kind of project, there has been a way in which there's been certain default scales and frames that we've worked with. If the question, in a certain sense, is like, shouldn't we open that up a bit more? Aren't there other ways? Like, given that the sort of one of the foundational ideas of the theoretical level is this relationship between how it is that certain things in the world are given this technical capacity to sense and model and record and index and represent other things in the world for themselves, whether that's through organismic senses or these technical apparatus and so forth and so on. And that through this basis, is there an interest that there's some way in which these epistemic shifts might take place? Shouldn't that be one of the spaces in which we're exploring for the Development Project? Sure. If that's of interest, I definitely support that. Yeah.
I want to sort of open a conversation about this idea of Copernican turn and Copernican trauma. Because I think there is a little bit of asymmetry in different examples that you presented. We clearly understand what's the trauma with Darwinian biology. We clearly understand what's the trauma of maybe seeing the image of the Earth and conversation about flat Earth, but it's yet not apparent what's the trauma that comes from seeing the black hole image.
Right. So that's why I tried to articulate a little bit of what my hopes and dreams for the trauma.
But I think
it might be, yeah, right. And so it's a little bit up to us.
Traumatized later.
Absolutely. No, I mean, this premise of the apex mediating residue and this understanding of ourselves as this kind of transitive layer within this sort of altruistic thing is a little bit where I think some of this intention would sort of go. Yeah.
Can I go?
Again, it's a bit of a, as I think I also answered in terms of sort of his question over here, or my reply to this question over here had everything to do with this, the idea that this trauma is something that we need to coax out of the image to a little bit around this as well, rather than just stand dumbfounded in front of it. Though you're welcome to do that too. Yeah.
I guess just a continuation of a previous question from Yanni and your response to it. A clarification. Did I understand you correctly that you said that you're not entirely opposed to a project where geopolitical precedes geotechnical?
No.
You just want to propose an alternative project?
Sure.
Where geotechnical precedes geo or political?
Yeah, I mean, I think very clearly once we get into the thick of this, that the where you can draw the line between the two should get kind of a little bit sort of a little bit mixed up. I think that there's part of the I think sort of starting point, what I hope is a kind of corrective starting point a little bit sort of here as well, is that projects that would make a strong differentiation between the two, that would operate from a position of what I sort of think of as a kind of political reductionist kind of starting point, that would identify the technical systems as a separate thing and something that is uniquely emblematic of a form of, as the Frankfurt School put it, a kind of techno-scientific rationality that is the core culprit of the Anthropocene. That is something that we would want to offer an alternative on each point. Yeah.
And you've also mentioned that there's some historical examples of geotechnical transformation preceding geopolitical transformation. Can you maybe describe some examples?
Writing.
And especially where...
Writing.
Where, okay.
Printing press. Trains, bicycles, antibiotics, agriculture.
what kind of geopolitical transformation has that led to?
What do you want? All of them. Which one did they sort of lead to? Well, printing press. I mean, there's Benedict Anderson's famous sort of argument about the development of the printing press and the composition of publics, a sort of specific reading public that became the basis of national cultures, which laid the foundation for later for nation states. And this relationship of nationalism within readership is the sort of like the object example. McLuhan and Ong and all the other sort of stuff around the printing press would be one thing. There's a lot of literature around the basis of even the beginning of the city and the polity per se as a function of agriculture, for good or for bad if you're in
I guess that's what I'm curious in exploring how often geotechnical transformation precedes geopolitical transformation that we actually desire.
That we actually desire. About 64%. Yep.
Okay.
People who haven't gone get to go first yet.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the centrality of the visual representation. So, and in general, like
for which? For what?
For planetarity. So when all the history that you have told was told through the relation with the basically light and how we see things. And also it's very interesting how it can be misleading in a way that, exactly as you say, that the image of the black hole is the one of 53 million years ago. And it's always amazing how we, like, at the same moment when you say about this conflict with the phenomenology and the image of the Earth, how actually we are constantly feeling the planetarity in terms of gravitational pull. And also the same with for example, black hole. Like we can say that we see it 53 million years ago.
But we mistake gravity for ground.
Well,
we misrecognize gravity as ground.
Yeah, exactly, but we feel it, like
Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the same in the relation to the space. So we can.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think it was the point. In her definition of planetarity, Gayatri Spivak one of them she talks about is that there's certain ways in which that there's certain ways in which she talks about it, particularly in terms of the globality of technical systems, that it's something that cannot be embodied. Those things cannot be felt. And I think it's still an attempt to kind of recover the sovereignty of experience.
Exactly.
But I think exactly your point is demonstrations like this actually not so.
Exactly, but
we actually feel planetarity through gravity. We just misrecognize it as ground. Yeah.
Exactly, but also relation to other things in space. So when we think about the black hole and that we see the past of the space, but at the same time we experience the presence because gravitational waves, they travel without any latency like the light does. And so if something happens in our solar system, I don't know, the sun disappears immediately, we will not see it for 8 minutes, but we will experience it immediately. And so I was just...
If the sun disappears?
Yes.
we would experience this.
Yeah,
this would be,
for sure, but
yes,
immediately, not like we will see
close.
the light not travel to us for 8 minutes.
For a long, long
exactly.
time. Yeah. So this is, and this kind of derangement of temporality
exactly
is part of what we're now trying to figure out how to comprehend. We can't experience it. We can directly experience 53 million years.
Exactly. And so I was wondering also how we can go...
But you can make sense of its trace.
Yeah. How we can go beyond that then, exactly, to look
so this is, I mean, to your earlier point about O and the relation to SR, I mean, this is not so dissimilar to Meillassoux' archifossil, the capacity to make sense of the trace, even of something we cannot directly experience in this way. And in a way that the Kantian subject-object is not helpful.
But exactly, I'm thinking how the image is helpful for this or misleading, and how other things, like what could be other mediums to do that. So for example, when you read any sci-fi and they start to talk about the gravity on moon, and you immediately see how exactly it unravels into the completely different perception of the planet and completely different motion and the things that people can do there. Yeah. And so how can we also explore more that aspect and then also maybe use it in the projects? Like, for example, I remember there was something about the spoiler about the zero gravity philosopher or something like that.
Ellie During? It's not a spoiler.
Yeah.
I'm going to go through everything, whatever sort of thing. But yeah, Ellie During, who's who I teach with the EGS, he's sort of mostly known for his work on Bergson and Einstein, the Bergson-Einstein debates, correspondence around time, and his whole thing is about kind of different philosophical models of time and temporality, and some other stuff with Stiegler. But now he's gotten much. One of the areas of strong interest from his has to do with this groundlessness, zero gravity in philosophy. So yeah, you'll have some time with Ellie.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Very quickly, automation as ecology and artificial metabolism are two topics among 5, and how do they relate to each other? That's it.
Well, there's ways in which there's automated systems that, I mean, part of the ways in which we're beginning to, and it's admittedly not really, it's sort of in a germinal stage, but trying to conceptualize a notion or model of automation that would be inclusive of both biosemiotics and technical signaling in some sort of way, that we have this basis to kind of understanding these amalgamated cascades. And then the artificial metabolism has to do is not the sort of the process of the organization of that thing, but rather the thing that is being organized through you can automate. An artificial metabolism may appear through its automation in one way or another. I'm not sure. I'm trying to sort of land the question because it's kind of a big one. There's 17 different ways of answering the question.
I mean, somehow they kind of fall into each other a little bit, at least for me.
Sure.
But they're given as two.
Let them fall in. Yeah.
Let them fall.
Let them. It's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We probably could do one more question before lunch, but I think we should break soon so that we can.
Right. We'll pick up in the afternoon. Tomorrow, the afternoon is all on the plan, the artificial and the plan.
Is there a last comment or?
Someone who hasn't gone, yeah. Yep.
In 2016, there was this quote that kept going around to try and explain the not, in fact, Copernican trauma of the elevation of the Orange Man, the ascendancy of the Orange Man into the White House, which was from Andrew Breitbart, where he said that politics is downstream from culture. When we have in our kind of urbanistic maxims here, anti-mythology, when I first encountered this, I was a little bit unsure kind of what it meant. We've kind of elucidated a bit today, thinking about ecological movements and so on. But I wonder if part of metabolizing a trauma requires some kind of narrativization or so on. And I wonder how we can de-anthropocize that process. And I wonder if maybe a better formulation for our purposes might be that, in fact, I mean, I just to say, I don't actually believe that politics is downstream from culture. I think this was a knee-jerk oversimplification of the reality, and I think often that conditions, economics and things are what produces culture in a similar kind of dynamic that we've just been talking about, geotechnologies. But I wonder if a better formulation for us might be something along the lines of chemistry is in fact upstream from all of these things.
Yes, chemistry backslash. Yeah, it's all. Yeah. So, one of the things I want to specify the way in which the way in which I think I'm trying to put this idea of the Copernican turn in use in relationship to this notion of a disanthropocentrizing of the process, particularly because the critique of anthropocentrism, there's such a variety to choose from, with so many other motivations and starting points and implications. Sort of at work that to be careful, I should be a little bit more careful about what sort of mean here as well. And your point about the processing of the trauma as something that requires a kind of narrative function, I absolutely agree. I think the aspects of psychoanalysis that are sort of worth holding on to have to do with this process of auto-narrativization, and it's absolutely one of the things that we as a species are good at, is producing kind of hypothetical cascades, hypothetical models in which that relationship between conditional hyperstitional possibilities as pre-prototyped, not only in a predator-prey relationships, but just about the way in which we think about thinking about things, right? The argument is not against experience, is not against or against the experience of the experience in and of itself, but part of the way in which you might want to think about this is less like how it is that we could approach that question of that self-naturalization in a way that is non-human. It may, the more specific question may be how would we approach that in a way in which we are much more clearly cognizant of its humanness, much more clear and much more directly capable of in a way perceiving and experience that limitedness and that specificity in relation to this as well. And to the chemistry bat's last thing, this is some of the, there's a version of this that has, in other words, the question of the deatherization is a understanding of what it actually means to be human, right? Not to try to not only to, and what it means to be human is that something that is constantly in a process of self-transformation and external transformation sort of itself. But there's also, the debates in the 70s around between psychology and psychiatry of whether or not a mental state really should be, whether real trauma should be processed as chemistry or whether it should be processed as narrative, may to a certain extent have been a kind of false dichotomization. Narratives are chemical. Narratives are chemical phenomena. Narratives are matter thinking about matter in hypothetical ways.
Yeah, I think we should take a break. Should we meet back here at 2:30? An hour and 20 minutes?
Sure. Wait, is that what? Yeah. Yeah, that sounds good. All right, good. Thanks, everyone.